Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Thursday, August 22nd. Some interesting activity going on in both polar regions over the last several weeks. The Danish Meteorological Institute actually tracks daily mean temperatures north of 80 degrees in and around the North Pole, and their data suggests this is turning out to be one of the coldest summers going all the way back to the 1950s. And meanwhile, down in the southern hemisphere on the other side of the globe, the southern hemisphere total sea aerial extent is at near record highs for the date and has a chance to reach record high levels over the next few weeks or so, going back to the beginning period of the satellite, when the satellite records began back in the late 1970s. Let's first start off with the story in the north. This is the northern hemisphere sea ice anomaly, and while it is turning out to be a cold summer in the North Pole, sea ice aerial extent is still well below normal throughout the northern hemisphere for this time of the year. We're in this region right here, and really this trend began right in this time frame of the mid-1990s. Notice from this time frame on, there's generally be a trend downward in terms of northern hemisphere sea ice anomaly. Before that time, however, the sea ice was generally above normal, and something occurred here in the mid-1990s, and we've talked about this periodically at the siweather.com. It appears to be well correlated with a change in the sea surface temperatures in the northern Atlantic. Meteorologists track the sea surface temperatures in the northern Atlantic through an index called the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, or AMO, and that flipped phases in the mid-1990s, and it certainly seems to be well correlated with the change in the northern hemisphere sea ice anomaly. And in fact, let's take a look at that AMO index right now. And here's the AMO, Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation Index, going all the way back to the 1800s. Monthly values seen here. Notice right here in this time period, right about in here, the mid-1990s or so, right in this region right here, there was a flip from a negative phase to a positive phase. In other words, the sea surface temperatures flipped from colder than normal in the northern Atlantic to warmer than normal. That seems to be having the direct correlation with the sea ice temperature anomalies in the northern hemisphere. As soon as the Atlantic multidecadal flips phases again, perhaps in 5 or 10 years or so, I expect the sea ice will return to normal or even below normal, as it was in the early 1990s and the 1980s when we were in this particular cycle for the AMO. Well, here's the data from the Danish Meteorological Institute that is suggesting that this could very well turn out to be one of the coldest summers ever in their records, going back to the late 1950s in areas north of 80 degrees. Now, a couple things I want to point out about this data. There are very few weather stations in and around the North Pole. What the Danish Meteorological Institute does is they use the analysis data from the European model to track these daily mean temperatures. And what this plot is showing here, a couple things. First of all, the green line right here represents the normal values, the climatological normal values going back several decades. The red represents the actual day-to-day daily mean temperatures in those areas north of 80 degrees using the analysis data from the European model. And notice here, for the last several weeks, in fact 3 or 4 months or so, it's been below normal. This is, excuse me, almost unprecedented. In fact, I went through every single year going back to 1958 when the Danish Meteorological Institute began doing this sort of thing, and there's only one year that's comparable to this, perhaps 2010. Otherwise, this is definitely one of the coldest years ever recorded, back to 1958 by the DMI, the Danish Meteorological Institute, in and around the North Pole. Now notice, again, the below normal temperatures all the way back 3 or 4 months or so. This line right here represents the freezing line, 273 Kelvin line right here, this blue line that cuts across here, and temperatures drop to below freezing much earlier than normal in the areas of north of 80 degrees. In fact, a couple of weeks ago they started dropping below normal, below freezing, and still remain below freezing. Normally that occurs in the middle part of September. Well, has this drop in temperatures, or this below normal temperature pattern, in and around the North Pole had any kind of an effect on the northern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent. We've shown this map before. This is from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website. They get their data through NOAA. Snow and ice data comes from NOAA. And what we're seeing here is similar to the last chart that tracks day to day through 2013, the day of the year on this x-axis right here. What we're looking at is comparisons of the northern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent going all the way back to the late 1970s, 1979, when the satellite era began in terms of record keeping for this type of parameter, the northern hemisphere sea ice. And 2013 is represented right here by this yellow line, and indeed in the last few weeks it has tended to level off. There was a period here where it looked like it might drop all the way below all those years going back to the late 1970s, but in fact in the last several weeks it has kind of leveled off. It is now above those levels of several years, still well below normal, but indeed has leveled off over the last several weeks. So we'll continue to monitor this to see if in fact what is turning out to be one of the coldest summers ever, north of 80 degrees, as tracked by the Danish Meteorological Institute, if indeed it will continue to have any kind of an effect on the northern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent. By the way, before we get to the southern hemisphere story, this is a map from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website that compares the daily sea ice in the northern hemisphere from 20 years ago. And really there's not all that much difference. This is the current situation right here, August 19th, 2013 versus 20 years ago, 1993. What we're looking at is the colorful area here represents sea ice concentrations of 30% ice concentration or higher. And there's a little bit more of an extent here 20 years ago, and perhaps a little bit more in this region. Again, right in here and right in here, but in general, not all that different from 20 years ago. And again, perhaps the cold summer that they've been experiencing way up in the north, in and around the North Pole, those areas, 80 degrees or north, is starting to have some kind of effect on the total sea ice. So again, this is a comparison with today's sea ice aerial extent at the North Polar region versus 20 years ago. Not all that different. We'll continue to track this over the next several weeks. Finally, let's take a look at the southern hemisphere. What's been going on down there is quite amazing as well. This is again from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website. They get their data through NOAA, and 2013 is represented here by this yellow line. And notice right in this region right here, this yellow line for this particular day of the year, which is on the x-axis right here, it's one of the highest ever, if not the highest ever, for this particular date. Over the next few weeks, it'll go into that climatological period where sea ice typically reaches its maximum extent in the southern hemisphere, and there is a chance that it could get right in this region right here nearly at a record high. So we'll monitor that over the next several weeks. But right now, this yellow right here represents the 2013 point, and again, it is at a near record for the date compared to all these years going back to 1979, and perhaps over the next few weeks could reach certainly near record all-time highs for southern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent. We'll continue to monitor all of this. Interesting activity in both polar regions. Follow all of this over the next several weeks and months here at the SIweather.com. For the SIweather.com, that's it for now. I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.